Good afternoon to all of you. I have two announcements. The first announcement is that today there's a roundtable, so please make sure you all show up at the roundtable, 4 p.m. at the Barrel Room. And the second announcement is we're going to have our first film this coming Tuesday, February the 9th. So I invite all of you to please try to attend. The film is The Reluctant Fundamentalist at the Cooperage at 6 p.m. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. So today, I want to get right into it. Today, we are continuing our exploration into Malala's story. And specifically, we are, how that story happened, came to be. And today, we have an expert in the Middle East in general, and he's going to give us some insight into the context, further insight, some deepening insight into the globalizing context that relates to the Middle East. Dr. Barry Preisler is an international expert in the history and politics of the Middle East. He himself spent considerable time there, I think mostly in Lebanon, right, Dr. Preisler? Much of his research, is focused on that part of the region. He has a particular interest in relations between Islam and the West, which interests me very much. So I think he's going to have a lot to say, or probably has a lot of ideas about Malala's story. Dr. Preisler's PhD is from Cal Berkeley, and currently he is a professor in the Department of Political Science, where he teaches a wide array of classes there on international and national politics, theory, and systems. Please give a warm FYE welcome to Dr. Barry Preisler.
When I was about your age, maybe just a bit older, you are, I'm told, all freshmen, so most of you I expect to be 18, 19 years old. When I was 20 years old, not much older, I went to the Middle East, to the Arab, Muslim, Middle Eastern world. I lived there, I went to school there. When there were breaks from school, I traveled all through the area. Almost all the people with whom I developed deep and lasting friendships were Muslims. Now, I have been asked to talk today, if I've understood it correctly, I don't think I have, I'm not going to talk about Malala at all, about the global phenomenon, if you will, of the rise of radical and violent Islamic political movements, of Islamic fundamentalist movements, of Islamic terrorist groups, however it is that we tend to characterize this phenomenon. Your perceptions as Americans living in America, young people, your perceptions of the Muslim world cannot but be dominated by stories that focus on the violence and extremism associated with groups such as Al-Qaeda or the Taliban, or most recently, the so-called ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. In beginning to discuss this topic of what you see and what is dominant in your view of the Middle East, in beginning to discuss this topic, what I want to stress as stridently and forcefully as I can, that absolutely none of this phenomenon existed when I lived there, in my early 20s, that is, dating myself from 1970 to 1973. There were essentially no significant, actually just no political parties or mass movements or even clandestine groups, for that matter, of any significance or size anywhere in the Arab Muslim world, and even less so in Afghanistan or Pakistan at that time. No parties or groups of any significance who defined themselves and their goals, their character, by reference to the religious principles of Islam. Political Islam did not exist as a real alternative. It was completely dominated by other ideologies. If anybody if any Arab in the Arab Middle East in the early 1970s tried to propose, tried to argue that the best way to deal with the challenges facing the Arab Muslim world, if anyone tried to argue that the best way to answer those challenges was a return to the fundamentals of the religion of Islam, they were literally shouted down and condemned for proposing a strategy that was considered a strategy of going backwards in every political and cultural sense, rather than a strategy for going forward, for progressing forward, for modernizing, and for secularizing as fast as possible to deal with the political and cultural challenges threatening the Arab peoples, the Muslim peoples in particular, and the Muslim world in general, outside the Arab lands. I literally witnessed exactly this myself at the American University of Beirut, which is where I went to school, in Beirut, Lebanon. There was a Friday afternoon tradition. Talk about American ideals and American images. There was a Friday afternoon tradition called Speaker's Corner, a special corner of campus. The students were encouraged to exercise their free speech. The Lebanese, the Palestinian, the Syrian and Iraqi students, the other Arab students, the non-Arab students who were at the university, were encouraged to exercise their free speech about any topic that they chose, political or otherwise. Almost always when I was there, the topic discussed at this American university was a strident condemnation of American policies in the Middle East, most especially US policies of support for Israel. Now, the main ideological consensus of essentially every speaker I heard on every Friday was to stress the Arab Muslim world's need to move forward, to progress and modernize itself, which added up basically to adopt and learn the science and technology of the Western world, ironically, in order to turn back, to repulse the military and political threats coming from the Western world. This is a footnote, but an important footnote. A fundamental part of that modernizing, progressive strategy that was supposed to deal with a threat from the West was a downplaying of the political importance of religion. Precisely because these Arabs, these Lebanese, these Palestinians, and the rest of them, precisely because they knew that if religion became the basis of significant political movements and identity, it would divide the people of the Middle East, not unite them. To stress, by contrast, the commonality of all of these people, not just in Lebanon, but throughout this Arabic-speaking area, to stress the commonality of language, of ethnicity, of, if you will, Arab language, Arab ethnicity, and Arab history that they could all call upon as their common heritage. To stress those aspects was a unifying strategy. Essentially, all religions, if this worked, if this was the reality of the dominant political ideology, Sunni and Shia, Druze, Alawi, Christian Arabs or Muslim Arabs could in principle join together. This dominant ideological trend had many different facets, many different versions of it, what would be called Arab nationalism. All the Arab peoples should unite for common strength and common unity for a common political purpose to deal with the threat and challenges coming primarily from the West. Because it downplayed religion, precisely because it said religion is fine, but keep it out of politics. This unifying factor could also stress basically the themes of modernization and adaptation to the technological and scientific changes of the world, in which the Arab world, the Muslim world, tended to find itself behind, significantly behind the West. On just a handful of occasions at Speaker's Corner, what you could characterize as devout Muslims, devout Muslim students, tried to step up to the podium and counter-argue, go against the overwhelming common trend. They tried to argue that all of it was wrong, all of that approach was wrong. They tried to argue instead that what was needed was a rejection of all this modernization and copying of the West, that the best and truest path was a return to the fundamental precepts of Islam, a focus, a goal of recreating the character and purity, religious purity, of the original Muslim community that existed 1,400 years ago at the time of the Prophet Muhammad. If there was ever an ideal Muslim society, an ideal Muslim practice of the religion, the ideal is associated with the very founding of Islam and the community that the Prophet Muhammad created in the 7th century AD. Whenever I ever heard the very few voices at that time brave enough to speak up and offer that alternative, exactly what I told you did happen. They were shouted down, they were told, they were condemned for arguing for a policy that almost guaranteed that the Muslim world would be in worse shape rather than better shape, would be more unable rather than more able to deal with the threats of the West. It was a turning backward strategy rather than a facing forward strategy. And very few argue this. Again, by contrast with the world that what seems to be out there in the Middle East today. I stress all this, how profoundly different the Muslim Middle East was not so many years ago from what it has become today, to make as clear as possible what seems to follow, in my mind, logically from this introduction, the most important and appropriate question to ask and to try to address is how and why this change took place. It wasn't that way before, it is that way now. How did that happen? Why did that happen? And it's a little bit distressing because most of the scholarship, at least in America, most of the so-called experts in America, do not go this route. One place, at least for my money, not to look, at least, which is at best a footnote to the story, not the main theme or not the main explanation. At the best, it's a footnote. It's there, it's part of it, but it's a footnote. The least fruitful place to start, and the place that almost all discourse seems to start, is to look at the Quran, to look at the holy text of Islam and all the sunnah and traditions that are associated with the beginning of Islam. The Quran is the Word of God, and the Sunnah are the stories of the Prophet Muhammad in the early community, all of them more or less sacred texts. As I've said, unfortunately, this is where most so-called experts focus all of their attention. But briefly, I consider this a wrong track for fundamentally the following reason. The Quran has not changed one bit since the 1970s. Not one word, not one syllable is different today than it was in 1970. Now, I know most of you are freshmen, you're just getting started on this, but you may run into the following simple precept of scientific analysis and logical discourse. It goes something like this: you cannot explain change by a constant. If the Quran has remained constant, it doesn't explain change. You might try to say, oh, it's a different interpretation, a new interpretation of the Quran. Unquestionably, it is. But that just begs the question. There have been different interpretations of the Quran, schools of religious thought, theological thought in Islam over 1,400 years. They have arisen at different times, and they continue to arise. Again, it just begs the question, why this incredibly violent and extremist version of Islam arose in today's world when most people at the time I was in the Middle East would never have predicted it was coming. By contrast with focus on the holy texts, I'd like at least briefly to outline, we don't have much time, it's too much of a task to try to explain this story in one lecture. Perhaps I'll be able to teach a 2-semester sequence and get to it in detail. But I'd like to at least briefly outline how to address what I consider to be the fundamental question: how it has changed, and why it has changed. And for that, for my money, it is actually, we need to go back about 200 years, at least to get the start of the story. The beginning of the relevant framework to understand what the people of the Middle East have dealt with and how it has changed to what you see today. 218 years ago, in 1798, fairly famous Frenchman by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte took time out from what appeared to be endless battles and wars in Europe, took time out from those battles and went off to Egypt and conquered it. Napoleon's military victory over the Egyptian forces who tried to defend their country from a foreign invader, Napoleon's military victory was overwhelming and one-sided. Despite the fact that it was fought nowhere near the pyramids, it got sold back home, reported back home as, sure enough, the Battle of the Pyramids. The importance of this victory of Western military arms over Middle Eastern defenders of their country, the importance of that is clear only in retrospect. Looking back, we can see that as a turning point in history. From that time forward, literally to the present day, the people of the Middle East have faced an almost unbroken series of military defeats at the hands of one Western power or another. Initially from the French, with Napoleon, eventually from the British, Italian, Russians, and others, and eventually from the Americans. The political consequences for the people and political leaders of the Middle East of this unending military dominance has meant political dominance and or political interference of Western political military forces in the affairs, in the lives, in the governing of the people of the Middle East. that political dominance has shown itself in many ways over the last 200 years. Sometimes it has been crude and obvious political dominance. It has shown itself perhaps in direct conquest and occupation of the peoples of different sections of the Middle East, as when the Brits ruled over the people of Iraq, they ruled over the people of Palestine, they ruled over the people of Jordan, they ruled over all of Egypt until as late as after World War II. Direct military occupation and control. Or it could take a more subtle but just as dominant form, more characteristically of what America has done in the Middle East, when the American CIA subverted and overthrew many Middle Eastern leaders, including many who were democratically elected by their people. And America replaced these local leaders, these maybe democratically elected leaders, instead with leaders who would follow orders not from their own people, but from Washington. Dominance, but more indirect. This fundamental fact, the unending military and political dominance, again, and/or interference and subversion of the Middle Eastern states by Britain, by France, Italy was in there too, but most profoundly and most recently by the United States, has been the fundamental political fact, the intolerable reality that has faced essentially all the political movements, all the political leaders in the modern history of the Middle East. No other fact is as important, no other fact is as fundamental as that one. If you do not have real independence, true freedom from foreign interference, then you are a subject people, and your futures are determined by someone else who has their own interests in mind. Now that history I cannot go into in detail. It's not surprisingly a long and involved history, but let me see if I can give a summary overview. Again, starting 200 years ago. The political movements, the political leaders, the political parties in the Middle East that tried to reverse, tried to expel this foreign political military control, that tried to end once and for all this foreign domination over their lives, has basically taken two different forms, if you will, two different banners in the struggle for liberation. One type, which was the only type for the first 120 years or so, rallied the people of the Middle East in different places and different times under the banner was perhaps easiest for everyday people of that area to understand, the banner of Islam. Let us, Muslims, join together and fight and drive out the non-Muslims. Almost every liberation struggle seemed to be led by and defined by Islam as its rallying cry. In Algeria, I don't have a map with me, but Algeria, North African coast, it had been conquered and occupied and colonized by the French in the early part of the 19th century, the early 1800s. In the 1840s, the Algerians, under a local religious Muslim leader, joined together to try to drive out their French invaders, their French masters. In Sudan, again, no map with me, but think below Egypt, the country below Egypt. In Sudan in the 1880s and into the 1890s, the Sudanese rallied around a charismatic Muslim leader. Again, the banner of Islam, and again, it served to unite the Sudanese to drive the British out of the Sudan. Don't ask why the British were bothering with Sudan. They were there, and the Sudanese tried to drive them out. And in Libya, again, North Africa between Egypt and Algeria. In Libya, beginning in 1912, a local Muslim religious leader, very, very charismatic, extraordinarily intelligent, led a liberation struggle to drive out, in this instance, the Italians, who are trying to recreate a Roman Empire at the time. Two facts about these efforts of the people of the Middle East, 19th and 20th century, need to be stressed. First, these and others that I have not mentioned, others that I have not listed, they were essentially all religiously inspired, all rallying to the banner of Islam. Not the banner of Algeria, not the banner of Libya or of Sudan, which of course didn't exist yet, the banner of Islam. These are all characterized by trying to achieve liberation, if you will, following a unity based on religion, on Islam. The second overwhelming point, however, all of these religious-based liberation struggles of the 19th and early 20th century, all of them were defeated. All of them were militarily unsuccessful. None of them were able to liberate any territory from French or British or Italian rule. They were all militarily defeated. From their perspective, from the perspective of the people of the Middle East, and by World War I, it didn't get better, it got worse as more and more of the Muslim Middle East came under Western control. If you know a bit of your history, you know that the present-day countries of Iraq and Syria, Israel that had been Palestine, Jordan, Kuwait for that matter, all of that area used to be part of the Ottoman Empire up until the beginning of World War I. And since the British and French defeated the Ottoman Empire, they decided to divide up these territories that were overwhelmingly Muslim in composition against the wishes of the people in that area. So even more areas, even more of the peoples of the Middle East came under direct military and political domination of the West after World War I. It wasn't getting better, it was getting worse. From the perspectives of those who are trying to figure out how in the world to reverse this unacceptable political reality that they faced, from their perspective, you might recognize that many Arabs, and more broadly of Muslim intellectuals in the Middle East in general, came to recognize that as a strategy, as an ideology to achieve liberation and independence, Islam simply did not seem to work. What alternatives were there? Is there another rallying cry? Is there another flag under which you can get people to come together, to fight together, to give up their lives together, to achieve independence that would somehow be better, might be better than Islam? In their attempt to come up with a different formula, a different ideological rallying cry that would be successful, that would succeed in achieving true independence and freedom from foreign domination. They discussed and developed and debated, literally for years, the alternative ideology that I have already introduced at the beginning, the one that was dominant when I first stepped into the Middle East, what could be called secular Arab nationalism. The advantage of a secular joining together of people, the tactical advantages were enormous, as opposed to stressing Islam, which inevitably has trouble dealing with the demands for change in what people are supposed to be learning in school. Should you be memorizing verses of the Quran as your first and most important duty, or should you be learning your physics and your engineering, according to textbooks coming from the West? For Islam, that's a tough call. For an Islamic movement, that's a tough call. For a secular Arab nationalist movement, they can be, and they were, unabashedly modernist, unabashedly accepting, or at least trying to learn, the tools by which the West had come to dominate the Middle East, its technological and scientific advantages. Aiming for a more modern, a more secular Middle East was a good strategy, not a losing strategy, or so it appeared. The other gigantic advantage of stressing the commonality of language and Arab language and Arab heritage was the corollary of downplaying religious differences as not politically important. To stress your Arabness, you can be a Sunni. To stress your Arabness, you can be a Shia. Stressing your Arabness, people might forget that you're an Alawi. The religious offshoot of Shia Islam that is the religion of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, for example. To stress your Arabness may make the fact that you are a Druze, which is an extreme offshoot of Shia Islam. It can be found there, the Druze can be found in Lebanon, Syria, and in Israel today. Not a large group, but nevertheless, they're completely excluded by religious principles, but tend to be completely included in this period of stressing Arabness rather than religious differences. Again, potentially, not only all the Arabs of Lebanon, all the Arabs of Palestine, all the Arabs of Syria, all the Arabs of Iraq could join together in a common political movement, but all of those together, all of those countries, all of those boundaries, ultimately were bequeathed to them, were forced upon them by the imperialist powers. Who drew those lines that you see on the map? Many of them don't mean anything anymore, but many, look at the lines of the boundaries between Jordan and Saudi Arabia and Iraq. Straight lines. Somebody got a ruler, basically somebody in London, drew the boundaries, created the states that they decided were what they wanted, what the British and French wanted. The people of the area were given no choice about those boundaries or about what country they will actually be part of. The very boundaries, the very division of the Arab world into those different states was an imposition on them by the imperialist states. And thus Arab nationalism had a solution to that imperial division of the Arab peoples, remove those divisions and create instead a single Arab state. You didn't have to be very sharp. You didn't have to be college educated to understand the potentially strengthening logic of Arab nationalism and Arab unity. Was this an alternative? Did it look like a successful, or at least potentially successful, alternative to the failed strategy of Islam? Again, very briefly, at least for a number of decades, primarily after World War II, the Arab nationalist strategy, the Arab nationalist theme of Arab world politics seemed to be a winning strategy. The Middle Eastern leader who was the most famous of his time, arguably the most famous and most popular in the history, modern history of the Middle East, was the president of Egypt during the 1950s, during the 1960s, and up to September of 1970. His name was Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser. More so than any other leader, Nasser espoused the cause of Arab unity and Arab nationalism. In 1956, Nasser found himself attacked by the old imperialist powers, Britain and France. Long story, can't go into it, but he found himself attacked by Britain, France, and in collusion with Britain and France, Israel, called the tripartite aggression. Now, the irony of this one is that militarily, Nasser and Egypt were completely defeated. The Israelis, the Brits, and the French were able to destroy essentially all Egyptian military equipment, destroy the armies, occupy territory of Egypt. Despite the fact that these imperialists and Israel, working with the imperialists, defeated Nasser. Fascinating story, maybe someday I'll tell you. Somehow, at the end of the day, Nasser was still in power. Israel was told to get the hell out of Egypt. England was told to get the hell out of Egypt. And France was told to get out of Egypt. It looked from the outside like Nasser, with his Arab nationalist ideology, had pulled it off. It looked like Nasser and Arab nationalism won. At the very least, England, that used to rule in Egypt, was gone forever from Egypt. They were clearly, if nothing else, they were independent of British interference, British rule, independent of French rule. And even Israel was told to get out of the territory they had conquered in 1956. For most of the Arab world, it looked like somebody's figured it out. It's finally happened. Here is a strategy and ideology of strength that has turned the tables on the Western world, turned the tables on Western dominance in the Middle East. It is precisely in that context that what I described to you in my days at the American University were the overwhelming dominance of Arab nationalist ideology. One version of it or another, there's a dozen different versions of it, but nevertheless the common theme of how to approach and how to make a more independent, more truly independent Arab people, Arab states, simply overwhelmed all alternatives, and in particular the alternative of politicized Islam, or re-politicized Islam, re-militant Islam was indeed shouted down. Perhaps unfortunately for the people of the Middle East, certainly unfortunately for gaining true independence, the people of the Middle East then saw what they considered to be their great leader with great ideology. In 1967, another war took place, this time primarily between Egypt and Israel. And Israel fundamentally defeated Egypt in the 1967 war, a one-sided victory. Egyptian casualties almost 100 to 1 against Israeli casualties, an unambiguous one-sided victory. Now, from the Arab world perspective, from the Muslim world perspective, rightly or wrongly, I'm not asking you to agree with this, but rightly or wrongly, correctly or incorrectly, the Muslim Middle East, the Arab Middle East, has seen Israel as an imperialist, colonialist creation in their midst. And thus the victory of Israeli arms, as far as they're concerned, is the victory again of Western arms over Middle Eastern arms. So this is the great qualification. This is the great, maybe that doesn't work. Time for re-evaluation. there might be an opening for the Islamic alternative to emerge again. When I'm talking about 1967, it will take 10 years before that alternative will be seriously argued. But again, we need to explain a change, either being dominated directly from the West, as they had been in the past, or indirectly by people that the CIA had put into place to rule one country or another in the Middle East. In the late 1970s, something that stunned all of us. If you ask me or anybody else who was a serious observer of the Middle East, is there any future for a politicized version of Islam? They'd all say it's fading and fading and fading and disappearing from any serious discourse. But a stunning change of events took place. In this instance, it wasn't against direct military occupation by a Western power. It was, if you will, the quintessential CIA choice of a leader for an entire, fairly large country. One of the most famous instances of the CIA overthrowing a democratically elected leader, in 1953, the Prime Minister of Iran, leading a parliament that had been democratically elected, his name was Mohammad Mossadegh, was overthrown in a coup d'etat engineered by the CIA. He was replaced by what had been the young monarch who was very, very weak previously and had exited the country. His name was, or his title was the Shah, Mohammad Reza Shah. He was our man. He was our choice. He set up a state in which he got a great deal of advice and training, primarily in how to torture political opponents. And he ruled Iran for the next 18 years as pretty much an authoritarian dictator ruling over a torture state. He was our choice. We gave him 100% support. He happened to be sitting in Iran, in a state that was quite large, fairly well educated, and sitting on some of the largest oil reserves in the world. Iran did not have to be a poor place, full of poor people. And for all of his drawbacks, for all of his questionable pedigree, as the implant of the CIA, the Shah of Iran was a very powerful leader. He had the largest army in the Middle East, the best equipped army in the Middle East. What was infamously the most famous secret police, Savak, in the Middle East. If you made a guess, like Jimmy Carter made a statement in 1976, about who you expected to be able, a monarch, a king, who you expected to be able to turn over power to his successor, the Shah of Iran was the top of the list. He is so powerful. And nevertheless, from 1978 to 1979, this enormously powerful leader found that for all the guns, for all the army, for all the secret police force, if almost every Iranian hates your guts, even if you use your police and your armed forces to fire on your fellow Iranian citizens and kill hundreds and then thousands of them, most of the time that disrupts the opposition. Instead, they came back 40 days later. There were sequences of 40 days. If you know your Shia Islam, you commemorate someone's death 40 days after they die, and the Shah could not stop it. And eventually, the people of Iran, from their perspective, non-violently, violence was used against them, they overthrew one of the most powerful monarchs in the Middle East. The new government was something that stunned us. Part of it, part of the political forces that overthrew this, what appeared to be one of the most powerful leaders, the most successful political leaders in the Middle East, were leftist, progressive, not Arab nationalists, but Iranian nationalists. But much more important, and the forces that eventually prevailed as the dominant political force in Iran was an Islamic political movement. Eventually, they would recreate the state of Iran and call it the Islamic Republic of Iran. Their ideology was overwhelmingly and clearly religiously based. If you were an observer in the Middle East, you know what it looked like? It looked like, oh, we tried Islam in the past, it didn't seem to work. We tried nationalism, it worked temporarily, but it didn't work. But now one of the most powerful leaders ever has been overthrown by an Islamic movement. This was a turning point in the history of the modern Middle East, a turn or return to Islam as perhaps a political force, a political style of organizing yourself that could do what both movements, as much as they disagreed with each other, had violent ideological disputes, they were united in one thing, the goal. Both movements were committed and had as their primary goal the driving out of foreign, basically Western, more recently American domination of their lives. That's part of the story. That's part of the story. In just a few minutes here, let me tell you another part of the story. We didn't like Nasser. We didn't like Arab nationalists. We didn't like any of these movements that seemed to put their peoples first. However, if there was such a movement, and we were not supporting them, the Soviet Union, at least in one famous instance, supported progressive modernist forces, not in the Arab world, not in Iran, but in Afghanistan in the late 1970s and basically from 1980 on. In Afghanistan, a very leftist, progressive nationalist regime, which, by the way, has one of its policies to make sure that girls as well as boys received full education as far as they wanted to go. Since the Soviet Union was supporting this very leftist nationalist regime in Afghanistan, we looked to disrupt them. We looked and tried to find anybody who would take our money and take our training in blowing things up and fight against the Afghan government and against the Soviet presence in Afghanistan. Some of you may know this part of the story. A group that had not existed before, since they couldn't recruit enough Afghans, at least in 1980, 1981, 1982, they went to Saudi Arabia and recruited in Saudi Arabia. And the Saudi government, not my favorite government, but the Saudi government asked what the hell we were doing. The people we were recruiting, the Saudi government warned us, these are crazy people. Don't teach them how to kill. Don't teach them how to blow things up. But we did recruit them. And for some of you that may know this story, not only were they Saudi Arabians, but they carried with them something that had been in its own cocoon, more or less confined to the Arabian Peninsula, the most extremist and violent-prone version of Islam in the history of Islam. The dominant version of Islam that some of you may recognize by the name of Wahhabism. More or less confined to Saudi Arabia, we helped to import it into Afghanistan. The group that we put together, the Arabs from Saudi Arabia, we gave a name. We gave the name. CIA gave them that name, Al-Qaeda. We helped create Al-Qaeda. We recruited people. We recruited Osama bin Laden and others like him. And we did the same with the Afghans. People who would eventually become infamous as the Al-Qaeda terrorist group, who would become infamous as the Taliban with their policies of religious bigotry and intolerance. Very briefly, that is part of that change, the beginning of the change that took place. in about 15 minutes. Thank you very much.